Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. The top-ranked promoter Bob Arum is attempting to rewrite the narrative for his new signing Jarrell Big Baby Miller where it comes to failed PED tests. And this is not necessarily altogether surprising because Arum, new promoter, he wants to start with a bit of a clean sweep, get some of Miller's baggage sort of out of the way and have him out there as a guy that people can warm to again and want to see fight. But some of these statements for me don't add up, and it's a case of you can't have it both ways. And you'll see what I mean soon, but we'll get to the statements and then a few thoughts because, yes, some of these statements from Arum don't really stack up in my book at least. And if you've followed this channel for any length of time, you know this story with Miller, I was on top of it at the time, and I've kept track of the statements. So in terms of Arum's comments, so we'll get to those first and then on to a few thoughts. So buckle up. Let's go. So Arum been in Las Vegas for the Fury and Wilder fight, talking to reporters, saying of Miller, the way you address it, and I believe this, is he claims that he didn't know what was going into his system. And I'm sort of inclined to believe it. I mean, they get these street guys to train them and so forth. We're going to put him in with a top nutritionist and he's only going to eat and abide by what the nutritionist tells him. Otherwise, I can't promote him. Again, I'm telling you just what he told me, and it seems like it's valid. Now, how could you not know? If a doctor or somebody gave me drugs to take because of illness or so forth, I wouldn't know what I was putting in my system. I really wouldn't. And further on, he goes to say, what we made sure is, in effect, he served a suspension. And that's referring to, by the time he gets back in the ring, which is expected to be in May 2020, he would have had 1 year or so since those failed tests. 3 tests. So there was GW15-16, the first test, and then there was a combination of EPO, human growth hormone, and GW15-16 in the remaining 2 tests. So Arum also says we're going to see how good he is, and then we're going to put him in good. And then we have all these heavyweights. We can fight some of our heavyweights, some of Eddie Hearn's heavyweights or Frank Warren's heavyweights, and people want to see heavyweights. Getting back to some of Bob Arum's comments here, because this really is a bit of a shift here, trying to make out that Miller is a bit of a victim in all this and that we should give him a pass. But really, some of what he's saying here, does it stack up or is it credible? Remembering Jarrell Miller is a professional athlete who's been getting pretty decent paydays in the heavyweight division against some of the opposition. He had that DAZN deal, 3 fights, 7 sort of figure paydays against the likes of Thomas Adamek, Bogdan Dinu. And if we have a look at some of those statements from Arum, and the first one I want to sort of zero in on, and this is why I said, Miller, a professional athlete, he has responsibilities. So Arum says if he went to a doctor and took some drugs, he wouldn't know what was in it. But that's not really the case for a professional athlete, is it? It's a different standard. We hold these athletes to a different standard. So Miller should be aware of everything that's going into a system, knowing that there's drug testing, and for an Anthony Joshua fight, very strict drug testing. And because of these 3 failed tests, multiple failed tests, there's obviously the spectre and the suspicion that Jarrell Miller had probably been taking substances before. That is just what some people do think could have been the case. I'm not saying it was, but that is the suspicion as a result of those 3 tests. But because there was more rigorous drug testing, he got caught. But his explanations, and this is where I want to sort of just make a distinction between some of what Arum is saying and what some of what Miller had said previously. Jarrell Miller said that the HGH and EPO got into his system through a medical procedure. So bear in mind, you can't just ingest those substances. They have to go into the body from a needle. So there really is fewer explanations. You can't just sort of say it was a contamination through a supplement or something like that. It had to go in his system. And Miller has explained it as he had a procedure for an elbow injury, and the HGH and EPO were to help with that injury. And he's tried to talk it down and say that the levels there, he would have had to been taking EPO and HGH for 6 months to get any benefit. But he said he had an injection and he made a mistake and he had some bad advice. And I actually sought some independent advice on how credible that was at the time. And the people that I spoke to who were experts in the field of performance-enhancing drugs, testing and all that sort of stuff, just said it was laughable. Even though Miller does sort of protest that it was something that happened as a result of a medical procedure, but he wasn't aware what was in it. And that's the thing. He has an obligation in a strict liability system to know what's going into his system. So Arum's comments about if he took something, and he doesn't know what's in it, well, they're irrelevant because Arum is not, getting drug tested for fights. He's not under the spotlight for being a professional athlete who punches people in the head for a living and can do real damage through having an advantage through performance-enhancing drugs. And the thing is, Arum in these other comments, he says they get these street guys to train them and so forth. So Arum is effectively saying that the people that Miller was working with were responsible for what happened to Miller. And it's not Miller. Miller didn't know what was happening. But the fact is, you're injecting substances into your body for an elbow injury. You better make sure you know what's in that substance. And whether it's these street guys or it was a medical professional, and this is the thing, it's a bit vague and we don't really have a full picture, because if it wasn't a medical professional that was doing that injection, well, certainly the suspicion deepens for me, because Arum is sort of alluding to it was the street guys that were sort of working with Miller. And if it wasn't a medical procedure and it was just street guys injecting something into Miller's elbow, HGH and EPO, well, that's even a worse scenario than sort of been presented before. And he can't have it really both ways on it. And the problem for Miller is he's never fully explained how GW 1516 got into his system either. So he's trying to explain away the injectable stuff through a medical procedure for an elbow injury, but no real sort of comment on the other substance. So while Miller eventually took full blame for what happened and said, yeah, I messed up, I made some mistakes, it wasn't without incident. He did try to say he'd be vindicated first. He said, I shall be vindicated. But now Bob Arum is saying it's other people's fault for what happened to Jarrell Miller. See, this isn't going to wash with me. And I don't think it should wash with other fans, because Arum is actually trying to pass the blame off to someone else and make out that Miller is the victim here. And clearly with multiple failed tests, Miller can't be the victim, and he's the one responsible for whatever goes into a system, whether it is by accident or otherwise, because in a strict liability system, the onus is on the athlete. You can't just say it's other people's fault. And that's why Bob Arum should take an uppercut on that one, because it's silly, silly statements. But what do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe. Follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.